am again today to talk about this time topic 2.2, which is all about the Mongol Empire. So this is probably a lot of people's favorite topics. They are a fascinating empire. They do a lot of things that we tend to relate to the Mongols, right? Kind of bloody conquering of most of Asia. But at the same time, as we're going to see, is that they really helped create the modern world in a lot of ways. Not only through these conquests, but also through the way that they governed their conquerings, right? So first off, let's very briefly discuss who the Mongols were before this time, right? So they are pastoral nomads slash hunter foragers, right? What does it mean to be a pastoral nomad? That means you are following around herds, living as the herds go, specifically for goats and sheep. They lived north of the Gobi Desert in East Asia. And life out here was pretty harsh, and that made the Mongols also quite harsh, right? They expected everyone to be skilled horse riders, right? Both men and women and children. Skilled horse riders, as well as especially having courage in warfare and hunting, courage in fighting. Let's just kind of make it a little more broader there. Right. They had lots of other tribal neighbors who were all enemies of theirs, but one of their main goals was eventually to be able to kind of get access to the Silk Roads to kind of help them grow. Okay. And so we get into kind of our three topics here. The first one being Genghis Khan. So his original name is not Genghis Khan, but it is Temujin. And so something else I guess I should mention here, right? They're kind of broken up into tribes, right? Pastoral nomadic tribes, which is kind of what you have to do if you're pastoral nomad, because what you see happen with pastoral nomads is that if there are too many people following a herd, the herd's going to die off pretty quickly, and then you're going to run out of food. So we have a series of tribes. And the way that Temujin gains power is that he creates marriage alliances amongst the tribes. Right, so that's how he originally kind of gains power. And then he would also, one of the key things he would also do is appointed, he had a meritocratic system, right? He appointed talented non-family members to kind of key positions rather than family members, which maybe made family members mad. But what you see here is that this creates a lot of loyalty and also a very strong empire in government, right? He's a very ruthless man. He killed his own stepbrother. And the key thing that he valued most above all is personal loyalty, which is ironic considering he did not appoint his family members to positions, right? That would be very loyal if he did that. And so in 1206, which you don't even know the date, he gets elected. He holds a kurultai, which is kind of a meeting of the tribes, and gets elected as Genghis Khan. Or gets elected Khan and takes on the name Genghis Khan, the ruler of all. Okay. So where does he go first, right? Well, the first conquest he has is over the Jin Empire, which is the empire in northern China at this time. The Jin Empire is created by the Jurchen nomadic tribe, which is a kind of a big rival of the Mongols to begin with, right? And so he conquers the capital, the city of Zhengdu, which is now Beijing. And so this is where he gets his kind of reputation as a terrifying, as a brutal ruler or brutal conqueror, right? He would kill entire cities that did not necessarily surrender to him immediately. He would wipe out entire cities of civilians, right? And so that's his first conquest. And then he will move westward. He conquers the Karakitai Empire in Central Asia. And then lastly, he conquers the Khwarezm Empire kind of further in the Caucasus region. Right, kind of West Central Asia almost. And so by the time of his death, he conquers. He has a realm from the North China Sea all the way to Persia, right? A very large empire covering basically all of Central Asia, right? So he had very strong. How did he do this? He had a very strong empire, or very strong warriors. Excuse me. Um, right, especially when it came to the bow. Right, they were horse archers. Right, they were also very well disciplined. They were also very well commanded. They had a messenger force as well. They had messengers who would help kind of run messages throughout his massive empire to help with campaigns. And so they would create, they had these kind of recon units, and they would help map terrain and figure out which place to go. And then they kind of had these really interesting tactics, right, where they would have smaller armies go out and face an enemy at first, and then they would retreat. They would give the enemy kind of a false sense of security, and then they would outflank and outmaneuver with the bulk of their army and kind of just wipe these armies completely, right? Right. He would ask cities to surrender, right? And if they did, he would pretty much let them live peacefully. But if they refused, they would kill all the aristocrats, right? Kill all the leaders, and then basically enslave the professionals, right? The skilled people of the town, right? He enslaved artisans and miners to help kind of work in his empire in different places, right? Okay. They also really learned about the different technologies of these societies, right? They would use new technologies that they came across, and in particular, the one that they bring up is siege weapons, right? So siege weapons are weapons that help take over a town, especially one with walls. And they talk about portable towers and catapults that would help destroy the walls of these cities, right? And we already talked about the messenger forces. Okay. But the key thing, and I'm actually going to move this into the next section here, into expansion of the empire. One of the key things about Genghis Khan and his later descendants as well, right? So there's a difference between governing and conquering, right? Conquering is the process of militarily expanding, right, taking over new territories. But governing is what you do with those territories once you've conquered them, right? And so when he governed, right, he was him and his descendants, right? So what you would see here is the kind of very liberal social policies and strong economic policies to kind of help grow this empire, right? Liberal social policies and strong economic policies as well. Okay, let's provide some examples here. So the liberal social policies mostly included kind of cultural and religious tolerance, right? Any religion could be practiced within the empire here. And that's because the Mongols themselves did not really have a strong religious or cultural background. And so they kind of recognized that they conquered such a large area, right? It would just be counterproductive if they forced everybody to become Mongolian, right, in terms of culture, right? So that's one of the major reasons that they would do this. So he would also protect the Silk Roads with, let's actually put this in economics. He would protect the Silk Roads with the military that he had just used to conquer these areas. Right now that they're not necessarily conquering and expanding anymore, right? He would reassign the military to protect the Silk Roads. A lot of bridge building, right? They talk about how he maybe built the most bridges ever, right? We see the growth of new trade channels, the revival of the Silk Road, right? So there's that. The capital of the empire is Karakoram. Is that an A? Sorry, I missed it. Yes, it is an A. Karakoram is the capital of the empire, which is near the modern-day Mongolian capital, right? And this period, right, these liberal social policies and these strong economic policies, right, all combine to form an era known as the Pax Mongolica, right, the Mongolian peace in Asia, right? Right, and it's peace throughout the Mongol realms. Right. One last thing that the book did want to talk about is his attempt to make the Uyghur alphabet kind of the official alphabet of the empire, it doesn't work. But what we do see is it is converted to use the Mongolian language, right? And it's still used in Mongolian language to this day. Okay, so that's kind of Genghis Khan for the most part. Now let's talk about the expansion of the empire, okay, into different places, different territories, right? And so we're going to start with, there are four empires, but we're really going to focus on three of them, right? And we're going to start with Batu Khan and his empire, the Golden Horde. Okay, so Batu Khan and the Golden Horde expand into Russia and conquer the Kievan Rus and the Russian cities that lived there in the 13th century, destroying the capital of Kiev, right? And so we see him actually expand even further into Western Europe, attacking a kind of almost like a united alliance of European troops against the Mongols, right? However, he has to go back to kind of the center in Karakorum, where the successor of Genghis Khan had died, so it kind of created this whole succession issue, right? And then at that point, he stopped wanting to conquer Western Europe and kind of just ruled over Russia, right? And so this rule in Russia is what we would call a tributary state, right? They did not, the Mongols did not want to live in Russia because it was too mountainous, or not too mountainous, sorry. It was too forested for horses, right? The horses would not live well there. They needed to live on plains with lots of grass. And so they moved to the kind of plains of southern Russia, all right, and basically let the Russians rule themselves, right? And so the tributary state is centered at Moscow, right? Kind of a new center of culture and society in Russia from Kiev, right? And so the Moscow princes, right? The Moscow princes here so they are collecting the tributes, right? The Moscow princes, right? And so the Moscow princes will use the tribute, will kind of collect more than they need to help start building a kind of private army, right? An army for Moscow, right? To resist the Mongolians, right? And then what we start to see is an anti-Mongol coalition of Russian cities rise up against the Golden Horde in 1380 and defeat them. And so we see kind of after losing to the Russian coalition of cities, we start to see Mongol influence decline in Russia. Right, and we start to see that until they kind of take their own. They take independence in the 16th century, right? The only ones remaining. So we get freedom in the 16th century. Only the Crimean Tatars remain. Tatars being the kind of European name, Russian name for Mongols, and they will be around for quite a long time. Okay. The key thing here, we see a kind of Russian economic boom in a way. We see an economic boom due to the Mongols in Russia, or I shouldn't say boom, but certainly economic growth. Right. We see military development as we see the Russians try to kind of create a better organization of their military against the Mongols. Right. And then we also see kind of a growth in centralization as we see like the desire to create a more unified response to the Mongols. All right, but probably the key thing here is we see them isolated from the rest of Europe for quite a long time, which creates a very different culture going on in Russia at this point. Okay, so we got two other empires that they want to talk about. I do briefly want to talk about one though that they did not bring up, which is, it's fine that they didn't. The Chagatai controls most of kind of Central Asia, right? The Silk Road region in particular in Central Asia, but we're not going to focus too much on them. Instead, we're going to focus on Hulagu and his empire, what is known as the Khanates or Khanates. The Khanates. Okay. So Hulagu is the man to defeat the Abbasid Caliphate, especially with the collapse of Baghdad. In a year you do need to remember, one of the first we've talked about, 1258. Okay, with the collapse of Baghdad, the Abbasids fall completely, right? And we see the continued expansion of Hulagu into the Middle East and even almost into Africa. But he is actually defeated by a Mamluk and Crusader alliance in Egypt, and kind of prevents him from expanding further into Africa, right? But nevertheless, still has a very large army, a very large territory as well, right? And so we see this stretch from it's all Central Asia and Byzantium, right, or up to Byzantium, right? And some of the key interesting features here is we see Persian administrators running this government because it's much more efficient, right? We also see the Mongols living in the Ilkhanate convert to Islam over time, which leads to a lot of persecution of non-Muslims, which is different for Islam because Islam typically doesn't persecute non-Muslims, right? We see the massacre of Jews and Christians during this time, which really minimizes the amount of Jews and Christians living in the territory. Okay. The last major one, and possibly the most major one, I don't want to do that yet, is Kublai Khan and his empire in China, which is called the Yuan dynasty. Okay, so at this time, southern China is ruled by the Song dynasty, right? And the Song dynasty is very well organized, very hard to defeat, and it takes Kublai Khan quite a long time to conquer them. But once he does, okay, so we'll just say in China. Once he does, however, what we see is he, instead of using Mongolian traditions, he recognizes that China has very strong traditions, right? And so he continues to adhere to a lot of old Chinese traditions in his rule, right? And so what we see here is that we see especially religious tolerance for Buddhists and Taoists, right? And also these traditions, especially like political traditions, right? Kind of keeping the bureaucracy together, but as we'll see, it's not all the way together, right? Tolerance for religions makes the Buddhists and Taoists happy, not necessarily the Confucians, because Confucianism is not per se, it's not nearly as much of a religion as Buddhism and Taoism are, right? So they create Buddhism and Taoist toleration. We also see Muslims, Jews, and Christians actually move into the states, right? We don't, but we see China as part of this Middle Kingdom, right? And so we see most Chinese not happy with the control by an outside force. This idea of the Middle Kingdom, right? They're better than that, right? Okay. So, in terms of the role of Mongolian women, which is kind of just thrown in here, I'm actually going to come back to Mongolian women because what I want to talk about is the loss of power by the Mongolians in their different territories. Okay. Actually, this is just in China. I apologize. Okay, so what we see here is that we start to see the alienation of the Chinese subjects, right? They start to hire foreign bureaucrats, right? Which, as we've talked about a lot of times, the bureaucracy is a very esteemed position in Chinese society, right? And so we're seeing them really get upset that no Chinese people are being considered for the bureaucracy, right? And especially because then you're going to see these non-Chinese people become more powerful and popular in Chinese society, right? Um, right, and so we see Confucians quite upset about this, right? The upper class bureaucrats of Chinese society, right? Because they're losing a lot of their power, right? We also see kind of the Mongols stay separate from Chinese society, right? They don't let the Chinese marry Mongolians. They don't let them adopt Mongolian language or Mongolian clothing. Um, and so that greatly upsets the Chinese as well, right? It alienates them, right? Because they're not blending, right? And so we see a bunch of failed attempts, failed invasions of Southeast Asia in Japan. Right, kind of creating the eastern border of these massive territories, right? And so what we start to see, as this kind of shows that they're not necessarily as all powerful, right? We see the creation of the White Lotus Society, um, which is organizes an overthrow of the Mongolian dynasty. And then they're finally overthrown by this man, Zhu Yuanzhang, a Buddhist monk from a very poor peasant family. He helps kind of finally overthrow the Mongols and send them back to Mongolia. Okay. And he creates the Ming Dynasty, which we will talk about in a different section. Okay. The Golden Horde loses power almost at the exact same time, right? And then Central Asia is also conquered during this time period as well. By Golden Horde loses power at the same time. Sorry, this is getting so small. I apologize. And then the Central Asian, the Chagatai Khanate, is conquered by a half Turk, half Mongolian Tamerlane, who I think we will probably talk about later. Right. Okay, so lastly, let's talk about the long-term impacts, and they made it nice and pretty clear here. I'm going to number these out. I think that's easier to do. Right. So first off, this is the largest land empire in history. Just as the kind of historical landmark, that is very impressive. Right. The Pax Mongolica is very important. Right? The Pax Mongolica revitalizes international trade. Let's say it revitalizes Eurasian trade between Europe and Asia and within Asia as well, right? They built roads and they maintained and guarded those roads, right? We see a lot of cultural exchange during this time period. Okay, what are some examples? Okay, some examples of this include Muslim scientific knowledge to China, right? Especially when it comes to things like medicine, right? We also see paper to Europe, right, which will help create the Gutenberg's printing press in the 1400s, right? We also see the transfer of Arabic numerals and the lost Greco-Islamic medical knowledge. Not lost, I'm sorry, but this is new. Greco-Islamic medicine both of these things go to Western Europe for the first time, right, which is going to be a huge boom for those societies, right? A negative impact is they helped transferred the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death in Europe, out of China. Oops. from China to Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and Europe. Okay, so that's going to lead to a massive population decrease that we've seen. Right, so we also see the centralized rule by the Mongols, and will eventually be transmitted to their subjects over time. So their subjects will understand the power of centralized rule due to the power created by the Mongols for it. Right, they used a single international law. They used a single law code for all the states, which made it pretty easy to control their different territories. And so we start to see that when they decline, oops, that's not how you spell win. When they decline, right, we see the newly formed states adopt centralization and kind of copying the Mongols. Again, because they saw how successful it was, right? The end of knights in Western Europe, or at least a decline of the knights in Western Europe, right? Because the armor of Western European knights was just made them slow, right? They were too slow, and so we needed to see a development of new types of soldiers, which we are going to start to see. And then also, finally, walled cities are less important. And these kind of come to an end in Western Europe, right? The idea that building a wall is kind of crucial to a city, right? Especially because of the innovation of the cannon, which many people believe that the Mongols created. Okay, so that's going to do it for the Mongols, but we're going to continue to see their influence far and wide during this time period. But in the next video, we're going to talk about exchange on the Indian Ocean, and I will see